Welcome to this interview with the Institute of Transformative Leaders and Communities. Today we are pleased to have Bishop John Schol with us. Bishop Schol is currently serving as the Episcopal leader of the Baltimore-Washington Conference in the United Methodist Church, which also is my home conference, so it's a pleasure to be able to interview today with my home bishop. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about a wide range of different ideas and questions that pertain to leadership, and specifically leadership and development in the United Methodist Church. So Bishop, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely.
I really do appreciate it. I want to start simply by getting your personal opinion on what you've seen of the church. You have had the opportunity to serve in several different ministry settings as an executive director of a cooperative outreach. You've been a ministry director in the General Board of Global Ministries. You were a senior pastor of a traditional congregation, and now serving as an Episcopal leader. Given all those various roles, what sort of insights have you gained about our denomination and about how churches work?
Well, what a great question. I've really been blessed to serve in a number of different kinds of ministry that have given me a real sense of the church, the breadth, the depth of the church. When I began, actually my first appointment was a student appointment while attending Boston University School of Theology. So it was a small congregation in a working class suburb of Boston, and really got a sense of working with a small congregation, what are the needs of a small congregation, how to help a small congregation grow spiritually and also numerically. So that was a very interesting experience. And then from there I went to Philadelphia and was a part of a four-church cooperative. As a matter of fact, when I first went, I was the coordinator of the cooperative, part-time associate at one of the churches, part-time associate at another of the churches. And so the way I figured it was I was the only one foolish enough to do 3 full-time jobs for a minimum salary. But the wonderful thing about that was to see in a part of Philadelphia 4 very different churches, different races, different sizes, all very close together, and how they could work together to begin to create transformation in the community. And it was there that I began to learn about staffing and organization. And so when I began, I typed the newsletter, I mailed the newsletter, and by the time I left 12 years later, we had a full-time staff of 25 staff and another 50 staff that were part-time and seasonal, and just the development of organization and how to work with staff and lead staff. From there, I went to be the director of urban ministry and the Communities of Shalom initiative, and really began to understand how do you work with a broad initiative all across the country and even around the world, and how do you help ideas to move forth in such a broad area. And so learning how to communicate, learning how things work differently in different regions in the country, how context really helps to inform and influence ministry, were all valuable learnings. And then I went to a larger congregation, an in-town congregation, and really looked at congregational development. How does that congregation grow and develop as a congregation? And now as an Episcopal leader, as a bishop in the church, again, drawing on all of those different experiences to lead the church in this new way.
What would you suggest? We've got a lot of younger students coming into the seminaries these days. We've got an increasing number, for which we're grateful in the seminaries, of people in their 20s who are coming straight out of their undergrads. What might you offer them as a piece of advice as they're looking towards charting their career forward? My hunch is that you didn't see all of those pieces in your career from the outset. Right. So as they're thinking about it, should they be thinking about the sort of traditional sense of moving up the ranks through appointments, or should it be a more entrepreneurial route like you took that is perhaps charting different possibilities of ministry?
Well, when I started ministry, my plan was to do 4 10s and outs. So 4 appointments, 10 years each, and then out. And my first appointment went 12 years after seminary. So that kind of blew that model. And one of the things, that I really learned there was that long-term appointments, you can have a lot of impact and really help move things forward. But what I would say to anybody in seminary or graduating from seminary or even in ministry is what I did was I saw each appointment as a gift. And, when I started in some of them, most people would have said it's not a gift to have 3 full-time jobs, minimum salary. We were living in the 2nd and 3rd floor of a parsonage, very urban community. But it was a gift, and it was a gift from God that really helped me to better understand ministry, better understand how God wanted to use my life. And the learnings were amazing. I think the other thing that I learned along the way is to make it happen where you are. If you're always looking for the next thing, you're just going to miss out on so much. And as a matter of fact, in my first appointment, I was approached a couple of times about serving in another capacity. And I just felt that God had more for me to do, and I was blessed with bishops and superintendents that were willing to give me the opportunity to continue in that ministry. So really looking at where you are, how can God use you, what's the gift here? I actually never wanted to leave the Frankfurt Group ministry, and it was really the calling of God in my life that led me to the General Board of Global Ministries, something I never anticipated doing in my life. So that's what I would say. The great gift is the appointment that you have. The great gift is the people that you're working with. They may not always be the easiest people to work with, and I could go through a litany of people where my skills and abilities were deeply challenged. But as I look back, it was all a gift in helping to shape and form me and helping me to lead in ministry.
I want to shift gears now specifically to your role as bishop. After General Conference, you had sent out a letter where you had described what you had perceived as the sort of universal observations about what had happened in General Conference, and you made similar comments in your Episcopal address at the Baltimore Annual Conference meeting just a week ago. In both of those, you mentioned that you saw a lack of trust within the church. And from conversations I've had along the way, both with pastors and with professors here, that really struck a chord. And people seem to think that was a very effective way of describing what is going on. And I was curious if we could plumb that a little bit, and you could describe what you see as the mistrust, or what may be the cause of it, how it's manifesting, or where you'd like to go with that.
There's a number of reasons there's mistrust in the church. And a big part of it is there are cultural changes that are happening in society and also in the church. And these are really deep changes. And whenever there's deep change, people get anxious. And sometimes they look for people to blame about what's happening in society, what's happening in the church. And it's most unfortunate. Some things are out of our control. We don't have control over the economy. We don't have control over what happens in neighborhoods and communities in terms of transition. These things happen. And to blame the pastor, to blame laity, has never seemed to me to be a helpful way to look at it. But we often hold leadership accountable for how we're feeling. And that's the big issue that I am experiencing, is that it's not always about the issues, it's about how I'm feeling about those issues. So rather than really looking at an issue and saying, what's going on here, we get caught with our emotions. And when we get caught with our emotions, if we're not feeling good about what's happening, rather than looking in, we look outside. And we say, who can I blame? And so I see this by laity all the time, blaming clergy for what's happening. I see clergy blaming district superintendents. There's just a lot of blaming that's going on. Another reason that there's mistrust is because leadership has not always been faithful and authentic and transparent in leadership, and has even been abusive as it relates to leadership. And so this has created a lot of mistrust for leaders. And it's not just within the church, but what we see happening within society. So when leadership in society are not handling leadership well, whether it's in business and how they abuse and misuse resources and people, whether it's in government or whether it's in the church, then all leadership becomes suspect. And so we have that's happening. And then I think leadership is also having challenges in leading through these very challenging times. And so even leadership can blame other people. And as soon as you start to blame other people, then that's when the mistrust really starts to happen. So what I really think leadership needs to do is to really understand what's happening and why is this happening, and then helping to articulate that for people. Why are the changes happening? Why are more churches closing? Why are we having financial difficulty? Why are we having challenges in appointing everybody or looking at clergy and their effectiveness? What are all the challenges? And being forthright, honest, open, authentic, and transparent about that. But then also to receive and listen. And really it begins with listening to what people are saying. That's how you get an understanding. But it's a give and take relationship. So it's not just the leader sharing and saying this is what's happening and we have to shape up and move on, but it's also hearing back from people and what they're experiencing. And so it really needs leadership today, first and foremost, needs to be conversational. The second is that leadership needs to be able to tell the story. So what we're experiencing today has happened in the past. Generations ago, we've seen some of these same shifts that have happened, that's happening in the church. And so for leadership to use narrative leadership, which really says, okay, let's take a look at what's happened. So that we're not the first ones to experience things like this. Others have. And here's how they worked through it. Here's how they've dealt with it. Here's what we can learn from them. And here's how we can move forward. But the key is we need to move forward together. Not 100% of the people will come along. But we have to build coalitions and develop relationships that help people to move forward. And I think those are the things that are really going to help rebuild trust. Being transparent, authentic, listening to people, understanding that it's nobody's fault, that things are happening, and it's beyond any one individual's control or even a group of people's control. That we need to embrace leadership, that leadership is what's going to lead us through these challenges and times, and we need to hold leadership accountable. And so I think those are the things that really help to build trust.
That trust and communication are critical. They go hand in hand. So the transparency, the listening, the articulation of what's happening, all are critical pieces, it would seem to me, on the theory end of it, and certainly it seems to be in practice as well.
Absolutely. I mean, leadership is, 70, 80, 90% communication. I mean, it really is communicating the message, staying on message, communicating. But, the most important things a leader can communicate is the direction and the boundaries. Here's what we're working with. Here's the parameters. Here's where we're going. The other thing leaders need to do is to thank people. I mean, even in very difficult, challenging situations, people are doing their best. And how do we thank them and let them know that we appreciate what they are doing, the way they're working toward things? And a leader should also never be afraid to admit that they thought it was going to go this way and it didn't. And we're going to learn from this and we're going to move forward. But quite frankly, it was a mistake or wasn't what we anticipated. Be able to admit that and then move forward.
Well, given the importance of communication, then, cynics have argued that our connectional system is connectional in name only at this point because it's so complex. There's so many different actors, egos, as well as just bureaucratic pieces in the puzzle, that the ability to have any kind of genuine communication or transparency across the entire spectrum of general agencies to conferences to local congregations and everything in between has basically become an impossibility. The only thing that's holding us together as a denomination, quite frankly, are not the carrots, but the sticks of the pension plan and the trust clause. So how would you respond to that? Do you see it that bleakly, or do you think that there's some hope left in the connection beyond 403Bs and who owns the property?
Well, one of the great challenges that we have today is that, in my own personal opinion, I believe we overuse the stick in our life as a denomination. And you see that more and more the Judicial Council, there's a lot more rulings in terms of what's happening in the life of the denomination. You mentioned about the pension program, you mentioned about the trust clause. These are all ways of holding people together through negative influence. It's not to say the Judicial Council is negative. It's just that's a more negative process when we get into those types of processes. The reality is that, again, leadership has to emerge that begins to understand what it is people are looking for in life. And so in an organization, what people are looking for in a church is a sense of autonomy. Not that they want to work on their own, but they want to be able to make decisions that help to determine what their future is. Secondly, they want to get better at what they do. They want mastery at what they do. And so these are the things that people are looking for. They're not looking for carrots and sticks to motivate them. They're really looking for somebody who's got a clear purpose. This is what we want to be involved in. They want to be able to make their own decisions, and they want to get better at what they do. And that's where leadership really needs to come in. That's where we need to be working and leading with people. So there are many positive things about our connection. Our theological understanding and mandates for who we are, the full sense of being personal holiness and social holiness, this dual piece that really is very United Methodist, that we change our spiritual selves, that we grow in our relationship with God through Jesus Christ, and then we go out into the world and make change. The means of grace and practicing these means of grace, is very unique to United Methodist. Grace and how we look at things is unique to United Methodist. Our appointive system and this placing clergy that really looks at missional issues and how do we get the right clergy person in the right place that helps move something forward. These are all things that are great gifts for us as United Methodist. And so, yes, unfortunately, there are going to be these carrots and sticks that are going to continue to crop up. But we really got to focus more on purpose, helping people to make decisions that benefit their future as a congregation or an annual conference, that we have to help people get better at what they do. And this is what's really going to hold us together. That's the difficulty we're having right now as a denomination, is how does general agencies, annual conferences all work together to strengthen local churches? And that's one of the areas that we're just having a hard time figuring that out in a highly technological age, in an age where once the local church looked to the hierarchy of the church to do certain things for them, to do mission for them, to provide resources, to provide small group resources, Bible studies, all those sorts of things. Now we have churches developing those things on their own and packaging them and putting them out there. So now the question is, what is the new role for the general church? What is the new role for the annual conference? And how do we begin to live into that new role based on where things are and the way things are practiced? And we just haven't made that shift. So sometimes, we do lean back on the less effective ways of holding people together rather than changing and figuring out how do we stay focused on our purpose, our theology, the way that we do our theology, and supporting our congregations to grow and develop.
That's interesting. The way you wrap it up there at the end sounds similar to how Wesley had originally framed it, the idea of what do we teach, how do we teach, and what do we do?
Exactly.
Were the three questions he asked that framed all of his conferences with his preachers.
The original discipline was all about helping people to live a better life. Now it's just gotten all clogged up with rules and regulations. But it was the worship book, it was the hymnal, and it was just the basic living and the way to organize local church that helped people to live out their faith in the world. And now it's just gotten so far from that. It's really a challenge.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Part of what I do when I teach evangelism, I point to the fact that early American Methodists had two phases to their evangelism. One was to call people to conversion, but then, this is not often remembered, after they converted them, they would offer a second appointment where they would come back and they would actually read the discipline, and then it opened the doors of the church. And it's impossible today to imagine someone reading the book of discipline as an evangelistic tool.
Right.
That said, I'm curious, you've spoken quite a bit about the importance of dealing with non and nominally religious folks in the culture that's around us. And as you well know, that the so-called nones, the people who claim no religious affiliation, not that they're anti-religious, but they're just not interested in affiliating with a religion, has grown remarkably in the last decade. How is it that what you're envisioning about this need to change the church and to reclaim, in some sense, who we are and how we share ourselves with others, how does that tie into the concern that you have for reaching out to these non and nominally religious folks?
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say the greatest gift to the church at this moment are non and nominally religious people. The people that we think are actually anti-church or are creating real challenges for the church today because they're not coming to church or they're not engaging in church the way we'd like, is actually, I believe, going to turn out to be our greatest gift. And as I continue to talk with non and nominally religious people, and I try and do that every opportunity, whether I'm on an airplane or somewhere, I'm always trying to talk with people to understand who they are, how they're thinking, what they're believing, what they're looking for in life, because I think that speaks to who the church ought to be in life. And so what I'm hearing from the non and nominally religious is that they are spiritual people. They're looking for purpose in life. They're looking for meaning. And what they're saying is, I'm not finding it in the church. When I go to church, I find that they try to keep people out rather than welcoming people in. I find that they have all these rules and regulations that makes it hard to find purpose. I find that they focus on their own institution rather than the world. And so they're teaching us a lot about who we are and how we're acting. And if we're going to connect in powerful ways into the future, it is going to be to listen to the non and nominally religious. I believe that we need to be in a season as the church right now, not to try and convert them, not to try and help them see that they're wrong and we're right, but just to listen. And then for the church to talk about what they're hearing. So, I talk about this wherever I go, and I say, I'm talking about your children, your grandchildren. And it just opens up for people, that's exactly right. And I feel powerless. I try to get them to come to church. And that's what I'm saying. Don't try and get them to come to church. Try and go to them. Because here's what the non and nominally religious will say. I'm having church when I'm at Starbucks talking about God with my friends. I'm having church when I'm working in the homeless shelter. I'm having church when I'm with my friend who lost their sister to leukemia. And so they see church in a very different way. It's not that they're anti-church. It's not that they're not spiritual. But what they're saying to us is, how I see church, the church isn't making that real for me. It creates all these barriers, all these hurdles that really get in the way of me practicing church. And so I think this is where the church needs to be in a listening mode to really understand and then to begin to shape the church so that it speaks meaningfully and purposefully and powerfully to people who are really searching and wanting to be on a quest, wanting to be on a journey, but they're just not finding that in the church because we're knocking heads because we want them to think like us, we want them to act like us, and that's just not going to happen.
So here comes I think the point of knocking heads internally in the church on this. So if we're looking at the gift that the non and nominally religious are in terms of putting up a mirror to reflect, this is what we look like, whether we think we look like that or not. At the same time, internally to the church, we're trying to find metrics that give us some means of putting up a mirror as well. And so, as you're very familiar with the call to action and the drivers of vitality, the dashboard system that's gone in with the vital congregations, how do you see all of that being put together? Because there's an argument that can be made that it seems like the two are moving in opposite directions. One is saying we're all about what's happening internally to the church. The other is saying we need to be concerned about what's happening externally to the church walls, at any rate. How do you see those working together?
You know, I'm a pretty healthy person right at the moment. I run 5 to 6 miles a day. I try to eat right. You know, overall, my body feels pretty good. Little aches and pains here and there. I'm losing more hair than I'd like, but overall, you know, I feel pretty good. But sometimes I go to the doctor, and the doctor will check my blood pressure, will check other things, and sometimes will say, yeah, this is a little high, or your cholesterol, you know, it's right on the border. You might want to think about diet. You might want to think about exercise. And those tests that take some vital signs of mine help me to see things that I don't see when I'm looking in the mirror, or when I'm feeling pretty good, or when I get on the scale. And so the doctor is able to help see some of those things. Well, a congregation is very much like the human body. And as a matter of fact, Paul talked about that. We are the body of Christ, and we have all these different parts. And sometimes we can be feeling very good, or sometimes we're not feeling very good. And we need to do a check of what are the vital signs of a congregation, and how do we measure those vital signs, and what do those vital signs then tell us about ourselves. So it's even like a person when they go to the doctor, and the doctor says, you know, I'm a little concerned about your weight. I'd like you to lose some weight. It's the person then that says, yes, I'm going to lose weight, or you know what, I'm really comfortable with where I am. Or your cholesterol is a little high, I want you to take medication or blood pressure. And then the person makes a decision about what they're going to do. Well, this is the same way with the church. We can look at vital signs, we can look at particular metrics and say, here's what we're seeing. But then it's what's the congregation going to do with that? The congregation can resist. The congregation can say, you know, those are the wrong measures. I'm going to go get a second opinion. All of those things. And never really deal with what the issues are for the congregation. And so metrics, just like going to the doctor, are not, you know, the be-all, end-all. There are other things that really come. We're a whole being. And so in the church, that's one piece. There's lots of stories that are happening in the church, and they also tell about the body of Christ and the life that's happening in that congregation, so that don't always get seen in the metrics. There's other things that are happening maybe in the community that don't always get seen in the metrics. So there's lots of reasons why things are happening. The question is, what are we going to do with this information? We're going to take a look at it and say, okay, how do we need to respond? What is it that we need to do? Or are we going to say, you know what, we like the way we are, and we're just going to continue right the way we are without addressing these particular issues? So I would encourage pastors, I would encourage lay leadership to really look at their metrics, and what are the key metrics that are to be looked at. And so what we're saying today, right now, is the key metrics are new believers, professions of faith. Is a congregation making new believers? We think that the body of Christ should be making new believers. Is it growing? It doesn't have to be growing large, but is there some growth? And maybe not every year, but is there a growth over a 5-year period of time? Are people growing in their faith? Are they coming to small groups, Bible studies, Sunday school, and are they learning and growing in their faith? Are they getting out into the world and serving others? Are they doing things in the world? And are they giving generously to the needs of the world? So those are the 5 areas that we're measuring right now, because we think that's what makes healthy churches, and healthy churches make healthy disciples. And they're not the only metrics. We encourage churches to add other metrics to that make sense. But those are the 5 that we're talking about. Yeah, this is a baseline for congregations throughout our denomination.
I teach in the course of study where the local pastors come, and I had one this past summer who came into my evangelism course, and he was just depressed. You could see it at the outset, and he made it clear the reason that he was is he had concluded that he was a failure at evangelism because he was in a tiny rural church. The whole neighborhood around him had been shrinking demographically, and his church had been stagnant in terms of numbers for years. And he concluded that he was an ineffective leader because of that. And as I probed with him in the process of the class, one of the things that we found is that when he focused on that metric, he didn't look particularly good, but there were other metrics he could use. So it turned out that his little congregation sent more shoeboxes full of Encore supplies than the entire district did combined outside of him and what his church was doing. And so it was an epiphany to him. He had no idea that counted, as it were.
Sure.
So it's very helpful to hear that there are other ways of being able to recognize vitality.
Right.
Now, I know also, having been a small membership pastor at one point, that it's helpful to know that, because sometimes we don't end up getting all the apportionments in, we don't end up getting new people joining, but we've got other ways that we've seen God in action.
Right.
And so it's helpful to know that's acknowledged, that's recognized. Along those lines, sometimes the question is brought up, and you'd mentioned about getting people out into the world, and so you're looking at these goals. And I know that, again, from having pastored in my own churches, we often had the situation where we'd set goals forward and we'd fall into the trap of saying that unless the goal was accomplished by somebody that was authorized by the church to accomplish it, or was accomplished by a specific ministry or committee that had been authorized by administrative council to do it, then the goal actually wasn't met. It had to be done by this group. And how does that, it sounds to me like you're saying that that's something you're trying to move away from in these vital signs. It's not simply that does the church do this through its formal institutional bodies, but can it be accomplished at all in the development of disciples? So that it's not just are we bringing more people in for small groups, but if we have folks who are going out and planting Bible studies in their workplaces, and they're not under the oversight of the church per se, but it's one of our members that's out there doing that, that's something that counts, as it were, towards our vital signs as a congregation.
Goal setting is new for a lot of our congregations. They haven't been setting goals, and so this is really new for them. It's it can be very difficult for them, and they get sometimes too focused on the goal rather than what are we going to do. So the goal is to really push congregations forward, saying, what is it that we want to become? What do we want to look like? And we set goals toward that. But then you should focus on, okay, what are we going to do? And too many of our churches fall back on the structures within the church to try and get everything done. And what we continue to talk about is how do we free people up for their passion, for where their gifts are. So the most important thing is gathering people that are gifted and passionate to work on that particular goal and the ministries of that particular goal. And so it's a matter of freeing people up. So rather than saying, oh, we're going to give this to this committee, we're encouraging churches to invite people from the congregation who are passionate to work on this, have the gifts for working on this, to come together and work on that particular goal and the ministries that are going to help reach it. So there's a website that we've developed, umvitalcongregations.org, umvitalcongregations.org. And on there's a piece that talks about reaching your goals and also about implementing the 16 drivers of vitality. And there you'll see we encourage not working with the formal structures to get those done, but to capture people's gifts, capture people's passion, get more people involved in ministry rather than just the elected people of the church.
Along the lines of developing these goals, I know that in a symposium that I recently attended about the global reach of the United Methodist Church, one of the questions that I heard raised was the question of how do these vital signs translate across cultures? Is that something, and I'll, to be honest, and I'm sure you've heard the critique before, some of the concern from the folks who are international were saying that these vital signs largely focus on the needs of the American middle-class white suburban congregation. And it's harder to translate them into an international context. Do you have a sense for how do this goal-setting process how does that translate into the fact that at the same time, we're also seeking to claim ourselves as a global denomination?
Right. The first thing I would say is that everything we're working on right now are really based on principles. And so how things happen in a particular context is going to be different from context to context. So if it's suburban, urban, rural, if it's in the United States or in Africa or the Philippines or in Europe, and even here in the United States, is it west, is it northeast? There's lots of different things happening all around the country, as well as around the world. So context is very important on the how we do things, but the principles are all there. So if somebody wants to argue that making new disciples is a white middle-class suburban enterprise, I want to say read the Gospels again. If somebody wants to say that helping people to grow in their faith is U.S. centered, I want to say read the New Testament again. That these are biblical principles that all of this is founded on, and it really crosses over cultures, nations, geography, races, that these are based on biblical principles. Now, how you do them? Absolutely. That differs from culture to culture. So in Zimbabwe, how they do faith development and their class meetings that they have there, they call them actually sections, is very different than what people in Baltimore do. And so it's contextual. But they're developing people's faith in Zimbabwe, and they're developing people's faith in Baltimore. And that's what's really important and key.
Toward the beginning of The Purpose-Driven Church by Rick Warren, he makes the point that you shouldn't be reading this for specific practices, but for principles of how you can engage in more effective church development, because the practices were contextual to the Saddleback Valley, and it's not something that should be used elsewhere because it'll fall flat. You can't box that, but you can learn from the principles that he experienced.
Exactly right.
Well, just a couple more things I'd like to cover as we're looking over this. You've mentioned already in some detail about the importance of looking back at our heritage to help inform where our vision is for the future, and I very much appreciated that. Someone who specifically has studies not just evangelism, particularly American Methodism, and how it's developed in its missions over the years. I'm curious, as someone who's speaking out of the theological education world, how do you see theological education, and particularly the formal forms of theological education, the seminary, the theological schools, helping to participate in this process? I will say that I'm very much aware of having been on both sides of the aisle. I've been in the local church, and I remember saying seminary didn't prepare me for this the way that it should have. And there are all these ivory tower people that are in there that seem detached from what's going on. And now I live in the ivory tower, and I think, well, all these folks aren't catechizing their people properly when they're coming in as students, and if the local church has got its job done, then we would be able to do more to prepare good leaders to go out. And really, that's a kind of vicious, circular, and unhelpful argument to get into. That said, what's clear is that as the church is at this cusp of needing to change, theological education needs to change too. We can't continue operating as we have. So do you have a sense of where you would like to see theological education coming together with the church and trying to figure out what our next steps are?
We're a large, complex organization as the United Methodist Church, and there are all these different pieces. And each piece has an important role to make up the whole of the United Methodist Church. And I believe our seminaries, just like the rest of the church, is really in a time of change and trying to understand and figure out what its role is and how they can best interact in terms of training people to lead ministry. And we also know that, again, while the theological principles are there, how we apply them is just changing radically. And I think one of the most important areas that seminaries need to be reflecting on is leadership development and how to lead, and then also how to develop leadership within the congregation. Every effective clergy person is going to know about their own leadership style, and how best to apply their gifts to lead a congregation. And is also going to know how to develop the leaders around them. That's very important, to develop the leaders around them. I think seminaries, and I'm seeing this more and more, are paying more attention and focus on leadership development and honing the skills of leaders. I think the other is that seminaries can really be places that are doing some of the R&D, the research and development in terms of congregational development, congregational vitality, what is it that we're learning, and to apply some of the research skills that are already in our seminaries to better understand that. I think, the most important role of a seminary, has been consistent, is giving people a real foundational base from which they can grow from. That seminary is not the end. It's providing the foundational base that really launches people into ministry. And anybody coming out of seminary, hopefully, sees, but they're going to learn very quickly that if they got a good foundation, they can really grow from there and really learn more and how to practice these things in ministry. So, those are some of the things that I think seminaries can really assist the church with and continue to build. It's clear we're going to need our seminaries, but it's also clear, online education, global education, it's all changing, and how we're going to continue to work with this in the future is going to continue to change as well.
The research and development piece, I think, is well said, and that is something that I do think the seminaries are grappling with, because our old formal university model system is expensive to maintain and is also increasingly out of touch in some ways with what you described as the non-nominally religious in the sort of formal process of moving people through. And so learning how to redefine ourselves is going to be an arduous process as well. And if churches take a long time to shift, I think seminaries are another 50 years behind that oftentimes. Right. So the good thing is that I think we're recognizing together that we need to work in this together for mutual benefit. Mm-hmm. Well, that brings us to the final question I have here, and this is a question about legacy. And that is that someone who teaches the United Methodist History and Doctrine here at Garrett, I'm curious, 150 years from now, what do you think that students in the United Methodist History and Doctrine classes will be reading in the textbooks about our time? Maybe to put it in a fairer way, since that's a counterfactual and we don't know what they will actually be reading. What would you hope they would be reading about the early 21st century American Methodists and what our offering to them would be down in the centuries to come?
Clearly, the future is in God's hands, and God puts it in our hands. And the United Methodist Church is God's church, and God is going to bless the United Methodist Church as we continue to receive those blessings, but then bless others with what God has given us. And so there's much that God is putting in our hands right now, and that we are in a time of deep change and transition, that many of the things that we're experiencing are not just here in the United States, but are also global. And what people are going to read about us in the future is yet to be seen. And the question is, are we going to be able to become more like the church in John Wesley's day and the first century? Much more nimble, much clearer about the power of God and ritual power that God wants to work in the world, and that we need to allow the power of God to work in the world. We need to be raising up leaders, and even raising them up even more quickly and giving them opportunity. Francis Asbury, if you wanted to preach, he gave you a preaching station. If it didn't work out, you were out, within 2 months. But you got opportunity. And I think both laity and those moving toward ordained ministry, we need to give people the opportunity sooner to use their gifts and show what is God laying on their heart. It's not to say that they don't need good training, formal training, but we need to figure out how do we raise up leaders and bless them and get them leading in some ways in the church. These are the things that are going to be our path into the future. Are we going to reclaim the power of God and ritual power and that God wants to work through the United Methodist Church? Are we going to become more nimble and flexible like in the first century church, or John Wesley as he was establishing the class meetings, Francis Asbury establishing the church here in the United States, that we are ready to respond and react to things, not go through all these formal processes? Are we going to recognize again that it is the congregation that is the base for mission, that that's where mission happens, and they are on the front lines? And how is it that annual conferences, general agencies undergird and support? It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be doing things that congregations can't do by themselves, but it's really then how do we do it collectively, not how do we do this on our own. And so that's going to be a real key to our legacy in the future, is how are we going to work together in some new ways. And so what they're going to be reading about us is either they figured it out and they started to work in new ways that really captured the hearts and the minds and the imagination of people, or they settled back into what they knew, what was comfortable, what was familiar, and how that would just continue to deaden the church. So it's really in our hands. And, the thing that I hope is that we really will reclaim our history, become more nimble again, more flexible, more ready to make decisions as decisions need to be made, undergird the local church, empower the local church, train our laity, equip our laity to be doing ministry, not just to be recipients of ministry. These are the things that's going to create a great legacy for the United Methodist Church. The tools are here, the leaders are here, the resources are here. It's just really up to us.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your frank conversation, your openness with our viewers, and just your time. I know you're very much in demand, so thank you very much.
Thank you,
appreciate
Mark.
it.
It's great to be with you.
Absolutely.
Great.